Donald Trump cares a lot about his polls. And he cares about public opinion. If there's a clash on the streets, there are basically two possible storylines. One is that this is a bunch of crazy mobs, rioters, burning things down, and that the president is imposing law and order. And the other is that he's, sending armed people to crush civilian demonstrators in an exercise of their First Amendment rights. And so I think if there are big demonstrations, they're going to have to be disciplined and peaceful. And we're going to have to push that message.
I'm Jon Favreau.
I'm Max Fisher.
And you just heard from today's guest, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Barton Gellman. If you know who Barton Gellman is, even the name might make you a little anxious. He wrote a piece right before the 2020 election that basically predicted Trump's attempted coup. We talked about why he thinks that this time our votes will be safe, but maybe not America if Trump wins.
Yeah, there's some real good news, bad news out of this one.
Real good news, bad news. You win some, you lose some with Barton Gellman. It was a great conversation that should make you feel at least a little bit better about the next few weeks.
At least knowing
TBD on beyond.
There are so many things you could potentially worry about or be stressed about, and I am in fact stressed about all of them, but hearing from him, knowing which ones to really focus on and worry about, and which ones we actually have advanced a lot in the last 4 years is something. It feels like it gives you a sense of agency.
Best you can do.
That's right.
Barton Gellman, welcome to Offline.
My pleasure.
So you wrote a piece in The Atlantic just before Election Day 2020 that really scared the shit out of people. The title was "The Election That Could Break America. If the vote is close, Donald Trump could easily throw the election into chaos and subvert the result." Turns out you were onto something. Since then, you joined the Brennan Center for Justice to work on the specific challenge of safeguarding our elections from the kind of thing Trump tried to pull off in 2020. And I wanted to have you on because Trump and his followers are clearly laying the groundwork to subvert this election if he loses, or potentially subvert democracy itself if he wins, both scenarios that you and others have gamed out. So maybe let's start with the election itself. You wrote a piece this month in Time titled "Your Vote is Safe," which I took as quite reassuring coming from you. Why should people feel more confident that their vote is safe this time around?
Because election officials around the country have hardened their systems, have reinforced defenses, have increased auditing. We have got 98% of people will be voting with human verifiable paper records. There are backup plans and backups of the backups for the things that usually go wrong in elections. And the big question to me was, if Donald Trump disputes the election result and tries to overturn it, which I'm quite certain he will if he loses, can the system withstand that? Can the system hold? And I believe it can't. I believe that he will try, if he loses, to overturn the results, and he will fail.
So I'd love to unpack that a little bit, because there's obviously a lot of different entry points in the system where he could try to challenge the results. So you talked about sort of the voting machines at the local level, like the actual machinery of the vote counting has been protected a bit more since even 2020. Does a lot of your reassurance come from the fact that this time Donald Trump is not in power?
That is actually for sure a big piece of it. I mean, look, last time there were people trying to persuade him to send troops to seize voting machines. If you're not president, you can't entertain ideas like that. Last time, his appointee, the guy he wanted to make the acting attorney general, drafted a letter to the Georgia legislature after he lost the state, in which the Justice Department was going to tell the Georgia Republican legislature that it had evidence of wrongdoing that could have changed the election results, and encouraged them to send an alternative slate of electors, that is to say, fake electors, to pretend to be the electors and cast the state's electoral ballots for Trump. That would have been the Justice Department doing that. He doesn't have control of the Justice Department anymore, and that matters a lot. He does, however, have a lot of help from the national and state Republican Party. Last time it was kind of outlandish that he wanted to reverse election results. A lot of people had never thought about that seriously, and a lot of people poo-pooed my article in 2020 when I talked about how you would try to do that. But now it's become a comfortable and accepted thing in the Republican Party, and there are lots of well-resourced party leaders and lawyers who are getting ready to try to help them do exactly that.
So one thing that I've wondered about is what if these Republican-controlled state legislatures or the courts somehow delay sending the electors to Congress past the safe harbor deadline, in the hope that they could then, if no candidate gets 270 electoral votes, they throw it to the House, and of course, if the election goes to the House, Trump wins because Republicans control more state delegations. How much are you concerned about the fact that there may be a delay in sending the slate of electors to Congress?
A delay is actually, I think, one of the greatest risks that still remain right now. The Congress, in a bipartisan move a couple of years ago, reformed the Electoral Count Act, and they turned what was then a kind of optional deadline of December 11th for safe harbor into a kind of a hard deadline by which governors have to specify who the electors of the state are going to be. And it's left to governors. That, by the way, is good news because in the battleground states, 5 of the 7 are Democrats and the 2 Republicans are not election deniers. But meanwhile, what Trump and his allies have done in a number of states is to try to mount attacks on the certification of the election, the certification of the ballots, so that they're in a position, if Harris wins a state, to try to get the people who do the certifying to say, no, we won't certify. That is a losing battle in courts. So in Georgia, the state courts have stated unequivocally that election officials for each county must certify within 7 days of election day. They have stated that no election official may refuse to certify for any reason. In Arizona, the 2 Cochise County election board members who refused to certify an election 2 years ago have now been indicted for that. In Pennsylvania, judges have also put the kibosh on refusing to certify. So I think it's going to be a losing argument for these guys. But it is clearly part of their strategy that they're teeing up that they would use the certification process to stop electors from being appointed in time to vote in the Electoral College on December 17th.
So that is one risk. The other risk I've heard is, so say the Republicans keep the House, Mike Johnson is Speaker, and he decides that the Electoral Count Act, the Electoral Count Reform Act isn't constitutional and just decides to ignore it, and says that there's irregularities in the voting, and there's a set of electors from the Republican state legislature in one state and a Democratic governor in the same state, competing slates of electors, and then Johnson tries to pull some funny business in the House. Is that a risk that you're concerned about?
Well, keep in mind that it is not the Speaker of the House, if Johnson remains Speaker of the House. It is not the Speaker of the House who presides over the joint session of Congress that counts the electoral votes and certifies them. It is the President of the Senate, who is the Vice President of the United States, who is also one of the candidates in this election race. So there's no question that Kamala Harris will actually have the gavel at that joint session of Congress. So there is some limit to the mischief that Johnson could pull off. And as far as declaring the Electoral Count Reform Act to be unconstitutional, I don't think he can just do that and act to the contrary of the statutory law, he might mount an attack on it in court, and God, who knows what comes of that with the current Supreme Court.
Yeah.
I mean, there is apparently a legal issue about whether one Congress can commit a future Congress to doing a certain thing that the future Congress must obey, for example. But I don't give a lot of credence to this new January 6th shenanigans scenario. I think that whoever wins the most popular votes in any given state is going to get that state's electoral votes, and Congress will count the electoral votes, and the person who wins the election will be sworn in as the next president.
So it seems like there is some outside risk with litigation delays and safe harbor deadlines, and you never know with this Supreme Court what they might do, but generally the process of certification as it gets to Congress seems secure. We actually first thought about talking to you for this after the news broke that someone set fire to 2 ballot drop boxes in Oregon and Washington, which was a scenario right out of an exercise the government did to prepare for the 2020 election, which also then became a storyline on Succession. How much are you concerned about sort of threats like this, or even the threats of violence and intimidation in and around the election?
Look, I'm quite sure that bad stuff is going to happen. And if Trump loses, he's going to pull out all the stops to try to reverse the result. And during the election, there will be efforts to intimidate voters. There might be, AI-powered, disinformation telling people their election polling site has blown up, or the election is canceled, or who knows what. I mean, ballot boxes burning, a lot of things may happen that sound really bad. But what I think your listeners need to remember is that they're not cataclysmic. They're not apocalyptic. Let's take the case that there were ballots burned in Portland and in Vancouver, Washington, just across the border. One of them, 3 ballots were lost. One of them, there were 200 that seem to have been burned. On the other hand, election officials know exactly when they received their last shipment of ballots from that drop box. They know they are able to tell all voters who voted by drop box, if you voted after this time of day on this date, please send your ballot in again. If they have 2 of them, they'll only count 1. And if they only, and if one of them's been burned, then sending in a new one will fix that. The number of votes that are going to actually be lost is probably trivial. And, a lot of things that sound really terrible when you first hear them are fixable.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned disinformation, and, this is something we talk a lot about here, sort of the impact of the weaponization of information and the impact it has on public trust and opinion. I just saw today that a QAnon account posted a viral video that supposedly showed illegal ballot harvesting in Pennsylvania. Turns out it was just a postal worker delivering ballots to the elections office. Have you talked to officials, local, state, whoever, about some of the more effective ways to sort of fight the information war? They're fighting the information war. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, they're just speaking on repeat their reassurances about how everything works. It takes 2 IDs to get into this room, and let's take Georgia. I talked to Secretary of State Brent Raffensperger of 2020 election fame. As your listeners will remember, he's the one Trump called up and said, "Just got to find the 11,780 votes to reverse the results in the 2020 Georgia election." He told me that in 2020, the count was very secure and very accurate, and they did 2 recounts and a hand count. But because there was criticism of the Dominion voting machines, he has now hired another contractor, another technology company, that will do a second count a second tabulation of all the votes in Georgia. So one will be done by Dominion, but then Dominion won't check its own work. Somebody else will check its work. This is an example of the ways that these folks are trying to reassure voters that their votes will count, their votes will be counted accurately, and the election will be secure. Still, they have to contend with a lot of intimidation, a lot of threats, some actual attempts to assault them. I talked to the guy who's running elections in Durham County, North Carolina, and, he's arranged that all of his poll workers are going to get little badges with an activation button where if something bad is happening, they can just push the button on their lapel and call 911. It is a sad place to be in this country where election workers are facing this kind of threat, but they're also standing up to it.
Scary they have to do that. All right, let's turn to the less pleasant outcome, which is that Trump just wins the election. He's made a lot of threats and promises about ruling like a dictator, prosecuting political opponents, deploying the military against protesters, rounding up immigrants. You helped lead a series of tabletop exercises for the Brennan Center this spring, where a group of people basically role-played what could happen if Trump actually carried through on these threats. Before we get to how it went, can you sort of set the scene for us in terms of who was there, what roles they were playing, and how the simulation was supposed to work?
Sure, absolutely. And I have to give a disclaimer because I work for a tax-exempt organization. We did this exercise on a completely nonpartisan basis. We had Republicans and Democrats. We had 175 people playing over the course of 5 games. They were there. We had former governors, former 2 and 3 and 4-star flag officers, a senator, a couple of former members of the House, former state attorneys general, former cabinet officials, again, from every recent administration, including Trump's. We had a number of former Trump officials. Everyone in the room was pro-democracy with a small d, but their political affiliations were all over the map. And we deliberately did not try to test in these games any policies that fall within the normal range of political debate. It was all about how do you restrain someone who is trying to abuse executive authority to do illegal things that are contrary to the rule of law or to our constitutional structure, or to break sort of fundamental governing norms of a democracy. And so it was, what can you do if the president sends troops to crush a political demonstration that is protesting his election or his policies? Those are that, like every other scenario we tested, came directly from things that Trump has promised to do or said he would do or tried to do the first time he held office. What we were looking for is, can you delay or deflect or diminish the damage of these authoritarian acts by using the instruments of government or civil society? And I should have mentioned, we had people there representing grassroots activists, faith leaders, the business community, unions, NGOs like the Brennan Center, litigators, and so on. So, we were basically looking at a whole of society response.
And so the way it would set up, I think you guys had like a red team and a blue team, and you had the president. And then how did it work? The president would say, like, I'm sending in troops to X state. And then you'd have someone playing the governor of that state, or how did the gameplay actually go? Yeah,
well, that's pretty close. What we did was, in 2 of the exercises, we did not constrain the president at all. We called them, the everything everywhere all at once games, and we let the red president, who was a stand-in for Trump and Trump's agenda, do as many things as he cared to do along as many policy fronts as he wanted, so he could prosecute his political enemies and send troops and do mass expulsions and replace civil servants with political appointees using Schedule F, and so on. First of all, every president has to focus sort of the scarce resources of his own time and staff priorities. So in real life, it would be very hard to do a lot of those things all at once. But I will say it had the effect of overwhelming the blue team. The blue team had trouble kind of keeping up with all the things the red president was doing all the time. And by the way, we had red and blue, and those are like traditional designations in tabletop exercises.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had, for example, our games were played under the Chatham House rule, which means that we can't attribute things that were said or done to specific individuals unless they gave their permission. But a number of our players did give permission. So I can tell you that Christy Todd Whitman, the former Republican governor of New Jersey, played a blue governor in this exercise. And when the president said, I am federalizing the National Guard in your state, and I am ordering through my chain of command that these federal troops go break up those demonstrations because I'm calling them insurrections and riots. And I'm invoking my power under the Insurrection Act. Governor Whitman tried to prevent that by ordering her National Guard onto active state duty. And she actually commanded the adjutant general in her state, who is in charge of the state guard, not to obey any federal order. So that would be a fairly extraordinary thing. It's never happened, I don't think, in American history. And I think in real life it would not go well for the adjutant general if he did refuse to obey a presidential order when the president activated the guard. But what this brought up for us in our kind of after-action review was that we don't think governors and state attorneys general necessarily have a fine-grained understanding of the boundaries of their authority vis-a-vis the federal government in cases where they believe the federal authorities are being abused. So, what is the limit of the governor's ability or a mayor's ability to constrain what federal troops or federal law enforcement officials do in their jurisdictions? And those are not super easy questions. And we would certainly recommend that every pro-democracy governor and state attorney general and police chief pay some attention to those questions in the coming days.
Do you think a lot of governors have, since you guys did this tabletop exercise? I assume you probably have been in contact with a lot of state and local officials. Yeah,
we've put out word and we've given briefings to state officials in a bunch of states, and they are actively considering these questions. I just thought it was fascinating. We had two governors in our exercises, and they actually didn't know whether they could countermand a presidential order or whether they could do anything to slow down the activation of their state guard into federal status. And I just find it fascinating that you can hold an office like that and not really know what the exact boundaries of the authority were, because there have been so few cases in American history in which there was a conflict.
So which guardrails did the red president have the most difficulty getting around, and which were sort of the easiest to just plow through?
Well, we did not come up with, one weird trick to stop a tyrant. And in general, the blue team was frustrated by its inability to sort of throw its body in front of the train and stop the president if the president's determined to do something. But there were a number of things that can slow him down. For example, when he wanted to send in troops, I wrote about this in the Washington Post after the fact. He ordered, he tried to give the order to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who's not actually technically in the chain of command, but so that was clarified. He ordered his defense secretary to send in the troops. break up the demonstrations, which he called riots, and said, "Don't be gentle about it. Feel free to use all the force you want." And the chairman immediately, as his chief military advisor, started pushing back and saying, you need to give that order in a form that is not, obviously illegal on its face. And if you tell us to break up a political demonstration, which is an exercise of First Amendment rights, and to use force on American citizens, despite the constraints of the Posse Comitatus Act, and so forth, we need to clarify here, and we need to let you know what the consequences are. At one point, the president, in our exercise, said he just wanted to activate and federalize the National Guard in all 50 states. He just wanted all of it under his control. And in that case, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Northern Command, who was, in fact, a retired four-star general, said to him, you are about to take away more than half of our worldwide contingency force for military emergencies elsewhere in the world. And that would be very unwise, sir. And, it went back and forth on rules of engagement. Military is very much aware that it falls under civilian control and must obey lawful orders from the commander-in-chief. But under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, an officer is also obliged to disobey an unlawful order. And there's a high bar for that. You don't want to go around disobeying orders. And how do you know it's unlawful? But, the Judge Advocate General, who was one of our role players, was opining on the legality of presidential orders to use force on civilians. And in general, this process forced the president to narrow down and soften his orders. So, it's famously the case that Trump asked Mark Esper and General Milley, in reference to demonstrators outside the White House, why can't you just shoot them in the legs or something? And in that case, from Esper's account, they just ignored that. In this case, the military chain of command pushed back and said that would be illegal, sir, and got him to not give that order. They got him to change his order and sort of reverse his order to federalize all 50 states of National Guard when he realized, what a kind of calamity he was setting in motion. But in the end, they did not stop him from sending troops into the cities, and the troops did break up the demonstrations. And so you could slow things down, you could make them less worse, but you can't necessarily stop it altogether. The Blue Congress tried to defund, prevent the use of any funds, any federal funds for this exercise, and the Red Attorney General figured out a way to reprogram funds that were in a piggy bank for FEMA in case of emergencies to pay for it. We weren't honestly sure in the exercise whether that would work or not. But all the things that people tried were interesting, and they probably had some impact. For example, the faith leaders sent in a lot of clergy to the demonstrations. And they stood in clerical garb between the demonstrators and the troops, as if to kind of dare them to use force on a bunch of priests and monks and rabbis. And maybe in part, in consequence of that, the encounters with the troops were not violent, and there was not a lot of bloodshed.
So maybe public opinion still matters here.
I actually think public opinion does matter. I think Donald Trump cares a lot about his polls, and he cares about public opinion. And if there's a clash on the streets, there are basically two possible storylines. One is that this is a bunch of crazy mobs, rioters, burning things down, and that the president is imposing law and order, and a lot of citizens would approve of it if it were cast to them that way. And the other is that he's, sending armed people to crush civilian demonstrators in an exercise of their First Amendment rights. And so it's going to depend a lot. I think if there are big demonstrations, they're going to have to be disciplined and peaceful. And we're going to have to push that message.
So it seems like, at least in the exercise, the president can fairly easily steamroll Congress. The military maybe can slow him down, but ultimately he found a way to send them into the cities anyway. I want to talk about the courts, because in a lot of the scenarios, the blue team relied on a strategy of litigation to stop the red president. And it seems like that is challenging for a number of reasons. One, just the delay. Two, potentially the makeup of the Supreme Court. And three, the possibility, and, I interviewed Liz Cheney about this on Pod Save America, and she said her worry is that Donald Trump in a second term just wouldn't abide a court order.
Yeah.
Seems like the courts are not really the answer here either.
Well, I don't discount the importance of courts. There, in Trump's first term, courts did constrain his actions a number of times. And although he did a lot to change the makeup of the federal judiciary, not all the judges are alien canon. I mean, there are a number of Trump-appointed judges who have ruled against him in sort of civil and criminal and in kind of issues of presidential powers. So the courts may constrain him. The increasing partisanship of the Supreme Court is not a good sign. But the worst thing is, what if he simply flagrantly refuses to obey a court order? And that's a constitutional crisis, because it's two coordinate branches of the government. And I just think there again, public opinion is going to be a very important thing. I mean, are we a country that's going to sit back and watch the president defy the rule of law openly, just being openly a lawbreaker? I hope not, and I think not.
So, what else can we do to sort of Trump-proof our democracy aside from winning the election? I know one safeguard you recommend is pre-commitments. What are pre-commitments, and where are the areas that they would best be applied?
The idea of pre-commitment is that you get together with pro-democracy people. Let's say they're in the corporate world, or they're in a union, or they're in any number of places that have influence on our society, and say, can we agree here among ourselves that if a president tries to, let's say, declare martial law, that you're going to speak out against that? And they say, oh, yeah, sure, everybody's against martial law. We would speak out against that. Now, if you pre-commit, it can be possible to remind you of that pre-commitment, if and when the bad thing actually happens. And to make people feel that they won't be acting alone if they step up and object to dictatorial behavior. If you say, I've got, this company and this company and this company over here who are going to step out with you, so you have a better chance of getting people to overcome the natural human instinct to keep your head down and not pick a fight with the president. All
right, so it seems like the best hope here is still an engaged, disciplined, attentive civil society here that can continue to organize, shape public opinion, and and try to resist that way. And obviously, the best thing is to win the election.
And that's the part I am not in a place where I could comment on.
Of course, I understand. Barton Gellman, thank you so much for joining offline and letting us know both what's at stake and what we can do to preserve democracy. So appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.